The cold didn't just bite, it chewed. My fingers, numb and slick with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and freezing Atlantic spray, white-knuckled the rusted railing of the Poseidon. 4. Below me, 30 feet of churning black water waited to swallow me whole, but above me was something far worse. The sound was like wet leather tearing. That was Miller, or what used to be Miller. He was leaning over the edge of the catwalk, his jaw hanging at a sickening angle, clicking his teeth together in a frantic rhythmic snap. He wasn't screaming. They never scream. They just make that wet, hungry sound that burrows into your skull and stays there. I kicked out, my steel-toed boot connecting with his shattered face, and for a second, I saw it. In those milky, clouded eyes, there was a flicker of the man who used to share his coffee with me during the graveyard shift. Then it was gone, replaced by a primal, vacuous hunger. He tumbled over the rail, falling silently into the dark waves below. But the relief lasted only a heartbeat. From the main deck, the scratching started again. Thousands of fingernails against corrugated steel. We were 300 miles from the nearest coastline, trapped on a floating city of iron, and the world had ended while we were drilling into the seabed. It started 3 days ago with a supply helicopter. We were all on the heli deck, waiting for the mail and the fresh fruit. The pilot didn't flare. He didn't even slow down. The bird slammed into the crane, fire blooming like a hellish flower against the gray sky. We ran toward the wreckage, thinking rescue, thinking survival. But when the doors hissed open, it wasn't survivors that spilled out. It was a writhing mass of gray skin and gnashing teeth. They moved with a frantic, twitching energy, like insects under a heat lamp. I watched Henderson, our lead engineer, get pulled into the pile. He didn't even have time to yell before they were opening him up like a bag of salt. The smell hit me then. Copper and old, stagnant pond water. It's a smell I'll never get out of my pores. I retreated to the sub-level pump room, the only place with a heavy enough door to hold them back. Every time the rig groans in the wind, I think it's them breaking through. The emergency lights are pulsing a rhythmic, dying red, casting long, dancing shadows that trick my eyes into seeing movement in every corner. I can hear them in the ventilation shafts now. A soft, wet scraping. They're learning. They're realizing that the humans are hiding in the pipes. My flashlight is flickering, the battery dying a slow death, and every time the beam fades, I feel the darkness pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I found a flare gun and a rusted pipe wrench, but against hundreds of them, it feels like fighting a forest fire with a squirt gun. The rig is a maze of narrow corridors and steep ladders, a vertical graveyard where every turn is a gamble with a deck stacked against you. I remember the way the radio went dead. The last thing we heard wasn't a distress call. It was a broadcast from London, just a loop of a woman sobbing and a man in the background repeating the word sanctuary until the signal dissolved into static. That was the moment I realized there was no rescue coming, no Coast Guard, no Navy, just the ocean and the dead. I climbed through the shadows of the engine room, the heat from the massive turbines making the air thick and hard to breathe. The floor was slick with oil, making every step a potential death sentence. I saw Sarah near the pressure valves. She was slumped over, her back to me. I called her name, my voice a dry croak. When she turned, her throat had been ripped out, a jagged cavern of red gristle. She didn't growl, she just lunged, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with cut strings. I swung the wrench with everything I had, the impact vibrating up my arm and into my teeth. I didn't stop until she stopped moving. I sat there in the dark for an hour, shaking, listening to the ocean roar against the pylons. We were supposed to be safe out here. The isolation was our job. Now, it's our tomb. I need to get to the lifeboats on the south side, but that means crossing the mess hall. I can hear the sounds coming from there, the clatter of trays and the wet, rhythmic thud of bodies hitting walls. There are dozens of them in there, trapped in the dark, waiting for a sound, waiting for a scent. I checked my reflection in a shard of broken glass. My eyes are sunken, my skin caked in grime and dried blood. I look like one of them. Maybe that's the only way to survive, to become as cold and hollow as the iron beneath my feet. I gripped the wrench until my knuckles turned white, took a deep breath of the salt air, and stepped out into the corridor. The hunt was on, and I was the only thing left on this rig that was still warm. The corridor was a wind tunnel of damp, salt-clogged air, whistling through the buckled seams of the bulkhead. Every few seconds, the emergency lights would pulse a sickly bruised purple, casting long, rhythmic shadows that seemed to peel themselves off the walls and reach for me. I moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a ghost, my boots clicking softly on the diamond plate steel. The sound felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I kept my back to the wall, the cold iron leaching the remaining heat from my spine. My lungs felt heavy, coated in a film of evaporated oil and the copper tang of old blood. Ahead, the double doors to the mess hall loomed, like the entrance to a slaughterhouse. The wet, rhythmic thud was louder here, the sound of something heavy, something that used to be a person, swinging against the interior wall with the mindless persistence of a pendulum. I gripped the wrench until the metal bit into my palm. I wasn't just afraid of the things behind those doors. I was afraid of the silence I was carrying inside me. The adrenaline had burned off hours ago, leaving behind a hollow, crystalline clarity. I wasn't a technician anymore. I wasn't a son or a friend. I was a biological machine, programmed for one thing: the next breath. I reached the doors and paused, my forehead resting against the cold surface. I could hear them. It wasn't just one or two. It was a sea of them, a low-frequency hum of throat rattle and shuffling feet. The smell hit me through the gap in the seals, a gag-inducing mixture of spilled industrial-sized cans of peaches, rancid grease, and the unmistakable sweetness of human decay. I eased the door open just a crack, the hinge screaming a tiny metallic protest that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. The mess hall was a cavern of shifting darkness. The overhead fluorescent fixtures were shattered, dangling by their wires, sparking sporadically to reveal flashes of the nightmare inside. I saw a hand, fingers ending in raw, jagged bone, scratching uselessly at a laminate tabletop. I saw the back of a head, the hair matted with gray matter, swaying in time to a song only the dead could hear. There were at least 30 of them scattered among the overturned chairs and spilled trays. They were waiting. They didn't have the intellect to hunt, but they had the patience of the abyss. I slipped inside, the shadows swallowing me. I had to navigate the perimeter, sticking to the shadows of the serving line. My boots stepped into something soft and yielding, a discarded uniform, or perhaps what was left of the man who wore it. I didn't look down. I couldn't afford to. To look was to acknowledge the humanity of what we had become, and that was a luxury I had discarded back in the pump room. I moved past the industrial fryers, the grease on the floor making every step a precarious gamble. One slip, one loud clatter of a fallen pot, and the sea would rise to drown me. To my left, a shape detached itself from the gloom. It was Miller, the head cook. I recognized the stained white apron, now a map of dark, crusted continents. He was standing over the remains of a salad bar, his head tilted at an impossible angle. He wasn't moving, just vibrating with a low, subvocal growl. I froze, holding my breath until my vision sparked with pinpricks of light. I was close enough to see the salt crystals on his collar. I smelled the peppermint he used to chew. I waited for an eternity, my muscles cramping, my blood screaming for oxygen. Finally, he turned, his milky eyes staring at nothing, and shuffled toward the far corner where a spilled tray of silverware lay. I pushed forward, my eyes fixed on the red exit sign that flickered over the south side bulkhead. It was the only beacon in my world. Between me and that door lay the main dining area, a minefield of plastic trays and heavy oak chairs. I began to crawl, the cold floor biting into my knees. The sound of the ocean was louder here, the waves crashing against the rig's pylons, shaking the very foundation of the world. It was a reminder that even if I made it past the dead, the living earth was trying to swallow this place whole. Halfway across, a sudden violent shudder rocked the rig. A rogue wave, massive and indifferent, slammed into the substructure. The floor tilted. A heavy stack of ceramic plates on a nearby table slid, one by one, and shattered on the floor with the force of a grenade. The silence died instantly. The rhythmic thudding stopped. Every head in the room snapped toward the sound. I pressed myself flat against the floor, my cheek against the cold, greasy tile. I could hear them turning, the wet slap of their feet accelerating into a frantic, disjointed run. They didn't know where I was, but they knew something was alive. I heard the sound of a chair being hurled aside, the screech of metal on metal. They were converging on the source of the noise, which was barely 6 feet from where I lay. I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my eyelids no different from the darkness of the room. I felt the vibration of their footsteps through the floor, a chaotic, thundering pulse. One of them passed so close, I felt the stir of air from its movement, a cold draft that smelled of the grave. I gripped the wrench, ready to swing, ready to die fighting, but the pack moved past me, driven by the echoes of the shattering plates. I didn't wait for them to realize their mistake. I lunged for the south door, my boots finding purchase on the slick floor. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I ran. I hit the push bar of the exit door with my shoulder, bursting out onto the external catwalk. The transition was violent. The roar of the storm hit me like a physical blow, the wind nearly tearing me from the railing. Rain, cold and sharp as needles, lashed my face, washing away the grime but replacing it with a bone-deep chill. Below me, the Atlantic was a churning cauldron of black ink and white foam, 300 feet of lethal gravity waiting for a slip. The rig groaned, a deep, structural moan that vibrated in my marrow. The iron was failing. The salt air was eating the platform from the outside, while the rot ate it from the within. I looked back through the reinforced glass of the door. They were there, their faces pressed against the pane, a grotesque collage of pale skin and bared teeth. They didn't understand glass. They only understood the heat on the other side. They began to beat against it, their fists muffled by the howling wind. I turned and began the climb toward the lifeboat deck. My hands were so numb I had to hook my elbows over the ladder rungs to keep from falling. Every breath was a struggle against the gale. The scarcity of my situation began to settle in. I had no food, no fresh water, and the wrench was my only defense against a world that had gone mad. My tactical mind, the one that used to calculate pressure gradients and flow rates, was now calculating my expiration date. How long until the rig collapsed? How long until my body gave out? The psychological weight was heavier than the iron. I was the last soul on this island of rust, a king of nothing, surrounded by a court of the damned. I reached the upper gantry, the wind screaming through the latticework like a choir of banshees. The lifeboats, bright orange capsules of hope, were bolted to their cradles 20 yards away. But as the emergency strobes on the derrick flashed, I saw the problem. The storm had ripped the primary lifeboat, number 1, from its moorings. It hung precariously by a single frayed cable, spinning in the wind like a child's toy, bashing against the hull with a sound like a tolling bell. Lifeboat number 2 was still seated, but the launch rail was bent, twisted by the heat of the fire that had gutted the lower decks. I slumped against a storage locker, the freezing rain soaking through my layers. I wanted to laugh. I had crossed a graveyard only to find a tomb. I pulled a small, crushed pack of cigarettes from my pocket, something I'd scavenged from a locker 3 days ago. I tried to light one, my hands shaking so hard the lighter slipped from my fingers and vanished into the black maw of the ocean below. I watched it go, a tiny spark snuffed out by the vastness. That was me. That was all of us. I stood up, refusing to let the cold take me yet. I crawled toward lifeboat 2. The manual release lever was jammed, rusted shut by years of neglect and the recent salt spray. I swung the wrench, the impact vibrating up my arm, over and over, screaming into the wind with every blow. It was a primal sound, a rejection of the silence of the mess hall. On the 10th strike, the rust gave way. The lever groaned and moved an inch. I threw my entire weight onto it, my boots slipping on the wet grating. Slowly, agonizingly, the mechanism began to turn, but the noise had reached ears other than mine. From the stairwell behind me, a figure emerged. It was the chief engineer, Vance, or at least, it was the thing that had been Vance. He was missing an arm, the shoulder a shredded mess of blackened sinew, but he was fast. He didn't shuffle. He lunged, his remaining hand clawing at the air. I didn't have time to think. I swung the wrench in a wide, desperate arc. The heavy iron head caught him in the temple, the sound of the skull fracturing lost in the roar of the storm. He didn't go down. He didn't feel pain. He just stumbled, his momentum carrying him into me. We hit the deck together, the cold rain slicking the metal between us. His teeth snapped inches from my throat, a dry, clicking sound that set my hair on end. I pushed against his chest, the wet fabric of his coveralls tearing in my grip. He was stronger than he had been in life, fueled by a singular, mindless hunger. I managed to get a knee between us, shoving him back just enough to swing again. This time, I didn't aim for the head. I aimed for the knee. The joint shattered, and he collapsed, his leg folding the wrong way. He continued to crawl toward me, his fingers dragging on the grating, leaving a trail of dark ichor. I stood over him, the wrench heavy in my hand. I looked at his face, a man I'd shared coffee with, a man who had shown me pictures of his daughters in Ohio. There was nothing left in his eyes but the reflection of the storm. I finished it. I had to. The third blow was the hardest, because it was the one that made me realize I wasn't just killing a monster. I was burying my own empathy. I turned back to the lifeboat. The lever was down. The capsule hissed as the pneumatic seals broke. I scrambled inside, the interior smelling of stale air and plastic. It was a cramped, claustrophobic sanctuary, but it was dry. I hit the launch sequence, the vibration of the winch motors drowning out the wind. The capsule jolted, sliding down the bent rail with a scream of tortured metal. For a second, I was weightless, hanging over the abyss, and then I hit the water. The impact was violent, a bone-shaking jolt that tossed me against the padded walls. The capsule bobbed in the massive swells, a tiny orange speck in a world of gray and black. Through the small, reinforced porthole, I looked back at the rig. In the strobe light of the lightning, I saw it, the massive iron structure, tilting dangerously, its lights flickering out one by one. And there, on the catwalk I had just left, were dozens of them. They stood at the railing, silhouetted against the dark sky, watching me drift away. They didn't scream. They didn't wave. They just stood there, the true inheritors of the earth. I sat back in the pilot's seat, my hands finally stopping their shaking. I was alive. I had food for 3 days and a manual desalinator. I looked at the compass, its needles spinning wildly in the magnetic interference of the storm. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if there was anything left to go back to. The radio was a wall of static, a white noise reminder that the world had gone quiet. I pulled the wrench from my belt and set it on the console. It was covered in rust and blood, a grisly scepter for a hollow king. I closed my eyes and listened to the rhythmic thud of the waves against the hull. It sounded just like the mess hall. It sounded like the end of the world. I drifted into a fitful sleep, the cold, salt air still stinging my lungs, knowing that the real nightmare wasn't what I had left behind on the rig, but what I would find when I finally reached the shore. I was warm. I was breathing. And in this new world, that was the most terrifying thing of all. I was a beacon of heat in a cooling universe, and everything that was cold would eventually come looking for me. The ocean was vast, but it wasn't big enough to hide what I had become. I wasn't a survivor anymore. I was a carrier of a memory that the world was trying to forget. I gripped the seat cushions as the capsule plummeted into the trough of a massive wave, the darkness closing in, and prayed for a dawn that I knew, deep down, might never come. The rig was gone, but the iron was in my blood now, and the silence of the deep was the only thing left to hear my confession. I was alone, and for the first time since the outbreak began, I realized that being the only thing left that's warm is just another way of saying you're the only thing left that can feel the cold. I watched the last light of the oil rig vanish beneath the horizon, a sinking star in a dead sky, and turned my eyes toward the empty, howling west. Survival wasn't a victory. It was a sentence. And I was just beginning to serve my time. I reached out and touched the cold glass of the porthole, my fingertips tracing the salt streaks, and waited for the sun to prove me wrong. It didn't. The horizon remained a jagged line of charcoal and lead, a boundary between the hell I'd escaped and the one I was sailing toward. I was the last spark on a dead sea, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the wind was only picking up. The engine didn't die all at once. It surrendered in stages, a series of mechanical sighs and stuttering gasps that mirrored my own shallow breathing. When the final piston seized, the silence that rushed in was more violent than the roar of the explosion that had claimed the rig. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, the kind of silence that doesn't just lack sound, but actively consumes it. I sat in the cockpit of the small, salt-crusted maintenance skiff, my hands still locked onto a wheel that no longer had anything to steer. The ocean was a vast sheet of hammered lead, shifting with a slow, rhythmic malice under a sky that had forgotten the color blue. I was 3 days out from the rig, or maybe 4. Time had become a liquid, shimmering and unreliable. My skin was a map of salt burns and grease smears, and the water in the plastic jugs had turned the color of weak tea, tasting of polyethylene and despair. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rig again, a skeleton of fire collapsing into the black gullet of the North Sea. I saw the faces of the men I'd left behind, or the things they had become before the steel gave way, gray-skinned shadows with eyes like clouded glass, their fingers drumming against the reinforced plexiglass until their nails tore away. I reached for the radio again, knowing it was a corpse. But survival is a habit you can't quit until it quits you. The static was a dry, rasping throat, offering nothing but the ghost of a world that had gone dark. The first sign that I wasn't alone wasn't a sight or a sound, but a smell. It drifted across the water on a low, biting wind, the scent of scorched rubber and something cloyingly sweet, like rotting fruit left in a closed furnace. I stood up, my knees popping like dry twigs, and scanned the horizon. At first, it was just a smudge against the charcoal clouds, a jagged tooth of rusted metal rising from the swell. But as the current pulled me closer, the scale of it began to resolve into something monstrous. It was the Athelgard, a super freighter the size of a floating city, drifting listlessly with its bow sheared off as if something had taken a massive bite out of the steel. It was a tomb of iron, silent and towering, casting a shadow that felt cold enough to crack bone. My heart, which I thought had been hollowed out by the rig, began a frantic, uneven beat. It was a chance. It was a death trap. It was the only thing in 1,000 miles of dead water that wasn't the bottom of the sea. I grabbed the emergency paddle, my muscles screaming in protest, and began to claw my way toward the hull. Each stroke was a battle against the heavy, oily water that seemed to want to pull me back into the void. As I drew closer, I saw the rope ladder dangling from the midship crane, swaying like a hangman's noose in the wind. Climbing was a delirium. My fingers were raw, the fibers of the rope biting into the open sores on my palms, but the adrenaline was a hot, caustic fuel. When I finally rolled over the gunwale and onto the deck, I didn't find the sanctuary I'd hallucinated. The deck was a slaughterhouse. Blood, dried to a dark, flaky rust, was sprayed across the white-painted containers in patterns that looked like frantic calligraphy. There were no bodies, which was worse. It meant something had cleared them away, or they had walked away on their own. I drew the flare gun from my belt, the last weapon I had, and moved through the canyons of shipping containers. The wind whistled through the gaps, creating a low, discordant humming that sounded like a choir of the damned. I found the bridge an hour later. The doors had been welded shut from the outside, the steel scarred by heavy tools. I pounded on the metal, a desperate, irrational impulse, and to my horror, something pounded back. It wasn't a knock. It was a heavy, wet thud, followed by the sound of teeth grinding against iron. I backed away, my breath hitching in my chest, and that's when I saw the light. It was a soft, flickering amber glow coming from the belly of the ship, deep in the cargo holds. I followed it because I had nowhere else to go, descending through levels of darkness where the air grew thick and humid, smelling of old sweat and iodine. I found them in cargo hold 4, a cluster of survivors, maybe 20 of them, huddling around a makeshift heater fueled by siphoned diesel. They looked like ghosts, cast in bronze by the flickering light. And in the center of them, standing with a clipboard and a sidearm holstered over a pristine navy sweater, was Elias. Elias, the foreman of the rig's B shift. The man I had seen swept off the helipad by a rogue wave the night the outbreak hit. He looked up, and for a second, his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Then it smoothed into a terrifying, practiced smile. "The sea returns what it takes," he said, his voice a smooth, oily baritone that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Welcome to the Ethelgard, brother. I thought you were fish food." The relief lasted exactly 3 minutes. That was how long it took for me to realize that the survivors weren't looking at me with hope, but with a hollow, glazed pity. They were thin, their ribs standing out like the hulls of wrecked ships, and their eyes were fixed on the shadows at the edge of the hold. Elias took me aside, his hand heavy on my shoulder, a grip that felt more like a shackle than a greeting. He told me they had a system. He told me the ship was a fortress, that they had the food and the fuel to outlast the end of the world. But as he spoke, I looked past him. In the dim recesses of the hold, there were cages, not for animals. The bars were made of reinforced rebar, and inside them were the things from the deck, the infected. They weren't snarling or lunging. They were standing perfectly still, their heads tilted as if listening to a frequency I couldn't hear. Elias noticed my gaze. "We're researchers now," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a feverish messianic light. "We've found that they react to certain stimuli. They can be harnessed. They're the perfect workforce. They don't sleep. They don't eat. They just endure. We just need a steady supply of catalysts to keep the hormones in their blood reactive." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The missing bodies from the deck, the emaciated state of the survivors. Elias wasn't saving anyone. He was farming them. He was using the weak to keep the monsters viable, experimenting with a perverted science born of isolation and madness. "You're sick," I rasped, my hand drifting toward the flare gun. Elias didn't even flinch. He didn't have to. 2 men stepped out from the shadows behind him, carrying rusted pipes and heavy wrenches. One of them was Miller, a man I'd shared a bunk with for 3 years. He wouldn't look me in the eye, but his grip on the pipe was white-knuckled. "Survival isn't a victory, remember?" Elias mocked, throwing my own philosophy back at me. "It's a transaction. And you, my friend, just brought a whole lot of value back to the table. You're strong. You've got the rig's grit in you. Your blood will keep the alpha specimen fed for a month." The betrayal was a cold blade in the gut. I had fought through a literal hell of fire and teeth, only to find a man-made one waiting in the dark. As Miller and the other man closed in, the ship groaned, a deep tectonic shudder that vibrated through the floor plates. The Ethelgard was dying, taking on water from the sheared bow, and Elias was too insane to see it. He was building a kingdom on a sinking ship. I didn't wait for them to reach me. I fired the flare gun, not at Elias, but at the diesel heater in the center of the camp. The world exploded into a brilliant magnesium white. Screams tore through the air as the fuel ignited, spreading a lake of fire across the oily floor. In the chaos, the cages, weakened by the constant salt corrosion, yielded. The infected didn't scream as they burst through the rebar. They hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. I saw Miller go down first. He didn't even scream, just let out a wet, startled, "Oh," as three of the things tore into him with the mechanical efficiency of industrial shredders. Elias was shouting orders, firing his sidearm into the flickering dark. But the monsters were no longer his workforce. They were the tide, and he was just a sandcastle in their way. I ran. I ran through the smoke and the smell of burning hair, my lungs burning, my vision tunneling into a red haze. I found the service ladder to the upper decks, climbing as the sound of the slaughter below reached a crescendo of breaking bone and tearing metal. I burst out onto the deck, the cold night air hitting me like a physical punch. The ship was listing heavily now, the bow dipping dangerously into the white-capped swell. I reached the rail, just as the first of the things emerged from the hatch behind me. It was Elias, or what was left of him. His navy sweater was shredded, his face a ruin of red lace, but his eyes, those terrifying blue eyes, were still clear, still filled with a human hateful intelligence. He didn't lunge. He stood there, swaying with the tilt of the ship, a flare gun of his own clutched in a mangled hand. You ruined the work, he wheezed, the words bubbling through a throat filled with blood. He leveled the gun at me, his finger tightening on the trigger. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a plan. I only had the sea. I vaulted over the rail just as the flare hissed past my ear, a streak of mocking red against the black sky. The fall felt like an eternity, a long whistling descent into the unknown. When I hit the water, it was like hitting a wall of ice. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, and for a moment, I let the darkness pull me down into the silent, pressurized peace of the deep. But the iron was in my blood. The rig had taught me how to burn when everything else was freezing. I clawed my way back to the surface, gasping for air that tasted of salt and smoke. The Ethelgard was a silhouette of fire against the horizon, its stern rising into the air like the tombstone of a giant. It groaned one last time, a sound of catastrophic structural failure. And then it began to slide. The suction was a terrifying, invisible hand pulling at my legs, but I swam with a strength I didn't know I possessed, a primal, desperate thrashing against the end of everything. When the ship finally vanished, it didn't go quietly. A massive bubble of trapped air and burning fuel erupted from the depths, a final, defiant belch from the abyss. Then the silence returned. It was deeper now, more absolute. I was floating on a piece of debris, a wooden pallet that had somehow survived the wreck. The fire on the water flickered out, leaving me in a darkness so thick I could feel it against my skin. I was alone again. No boat, no food, no water, just the endless, rolling black of the North Sea and the stars that watched me with their cold, unblinking eyes. I reached out and touched the rough wood of the pallet, my fingers trembling. The betrayal of Elias had stripped away the last of my illusions. There were no heroes left, and there was no sanctuary. There was only the movement, the constant, agonizing push forward against a world that wanted you still. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the voices of everyone I had lost. I didn't fight it. I let it push me. I lay my head back against the wet wood and watched the horizon, waiting for a dawn that felt like a myth. I realized then that survival wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about the refusal to sink. I was a speck of dust on a dying planet, a tiny flickering spark in a gale of shadows. But as long as I could feel the cold, I knew I was still alive. And as long as I was alive, I was the only thing the darkness couldn't claim. I closed my eyes, the salt crusting on my lashes, and listened to the deep. It didn't have any more secrets to tell me. I had become one of them. I was the ghost of the oil rig, the survivor of the Ethelgard, the man who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking anyway. The water slapped against the wood, a steady, rhythmic reminder of the clock that was always ticking. I didn't need the sun to prove me wrong anymore. I was my own proof. I was the last thing left that could feel the cold, and in this dead, frozen world, that was the only fire I needed. The west was still empty, still howling, but I wasn't looking at the horizon anymore. I was looking inward, at the iron and the salt, and the terrifying, beautiful certainty that I was still here. The wind was picking up, and for the first time, I didn't fear it. I just opened my lungs and let it pull me into the dark. Survival wasn't a victory, and it wasn't just a sentence. It was a war, and I was the only soldier left on the field. The silence of the deep was no longer a confession. It was a challenge. I gripped the edge of the pallet, my knuckles white and scarred, and waited for the next wave. It came, massive and cold, and I rode it into the night, a single spark on a dead sea, refusing to go out. The end of the world had come and gone, but I was still counting the seconds, still marking the time, a living clock in a universe that had stopped. I was the cold. I was the salt. I was the last man standing, and the sea would have to try a lot harder if it wanted to take what was left of me. I watched the stars, those distant dying fires, and I felt a strange, jagged peace. They were like me, burning out, but burning nonetheless. And in the dark, that was enough. It had to be enough. I closed my eyes and let the ocean carry me toward whatever hell was waiting next. My heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against the void. 1, 2, 1, 2. The sound of a man who was just beginning to find his stride in the dark. The horizon remained leaden, the sky remained dead, but the blood in my veins was hot, and for now, that was the only victory that mattered. I was the only thing left that could feel the cold, and I would feel it until the very end. The wind screamed, the waves crashed, and I stayed, a stubborn piece of grit in the eye of God, waiting for the world to try again. It would, I knew it would, and I would be ready, because the rig was in my blood, the sea was in my soul, and I was the only thing left that wasn't afraid of the dark. The journey wasn't over. It was just changing shape, turning into something leaner, harder, and more permanent. I was the last spark, and the wind was only picking up, blowing me toward a future that had no name. I didn't need one. I just needed to keep breathing. And I did. One breath after another, a defiance in every lungful of salt air. I was alive, and in a world of the dead, that was the ultimate betrayal. I smiled into the dark, a jagged, broken expression, and let the sea take me. I was ready for the next lesson. I was ready for the cold. The cold didn't just sit on my skin. It moved into my marrow, a permanent resident in the architecture of my bones. I woke every morning to the sound of the North Sea trying to chew through the steel pylons of the rig, a rhythmic, violent grinding that served as my only heartbeat. The sun was a ghost, a pale, sickly disk that struggled to pierce the iron-gray shroud of the sky. And for weeks, I didn't speak. There was no one to hear, and the sound of my own voice had started to feel like a confession of weakness. To speak was to acknowledge the silence, and the silence was a predator. I spent my days moving through the guts of the Titan, 1-4 like a scavenger in the belly of a dead whale. I knew every bolt, every weeping seam of rust, every vibration of the massive diesel generators that I kept running on a diet of prayer and stolen parts. The dead were still there, of course. They were the white noise of my existence. Down in the lower decks, trapped behind pressurized bulkheads, and tangled in the substructure, they remained. Sometimes, when the wind died down, I could hear them. A wet, slapping sound as they bumped against the pilings, or the raspy, dry clicking of their teeth against the metal. They were patient. They had all the time in the world, and I was the only clock left ticking. I had become a creature of habit, a ghost haunting my own life. I spent the mornings checking the perimeter, my boots clanging on the steel grating, a flare gun tucked into my belt, and a heavy pipe wrench in my hand. I didn't use the rifles much anymore. Ammo was a finite resource, a currency I couldn't afford to spend on the stragglers that occasionally washed up on the lower platforms during high tide. I killed them with the wrench, clean, heavy strokes that felt honest. There was no poetry in it, just the physics of survival. The middle of the second month was when the great storm arrived. It didn't come with a warning. The barometer just plummeted like a stone, and the horizon turned the color of a fresh bruise. The ocean, which had been a restless beast, became a god of wrath. The waves climbed 40, 50 feet high, slamming into the rig with the force of a freight train. The entire structure shuddered, a deep, resonant groaning that vibrated through the soles of my feet. I retreated to the control room, the highest point I could reach, and watched through the reinforced glass as the world dissolved into white foam and black water. This was the test. The rig was a marvel of engineering, but it was old, and the maintenance had been neglected even before the world ended. As the wind screamed, reaching speeds that threatened to peel the skin off the earth, the lights flickered and died. The generators had choked on salt spray. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, I felt the rig tilt. It was slight, a few degrees, but to me, it felt like the world was capsizing. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of the rig dying. If the Titan went down, the last piece of solid ground in my universe would vanish, and I would be swallowed by the cold I had claimed to embrace. I scrambled down into the bowels of the machine, guided by a headlamp that cut a frantic, yellow path through the gloom. The air down there was thick with the smell of ozone and wet rot. Water was pouring in through a ruptured cooling line, and the deck was slick with oil. And then I heard it. The sound of the bulkheads failing. The pressure of the storm had done what the outbreak couldn't. It had broken the seals. The dead were coming up. They didn't scream. They just spilled out of the dark like a slow-motion flood. They were bloated. Their flesh turned to a soapy gray sludge by the salt water, their eyes milky and vacant. I met the first one at the base of the stairwell. It was Miller, or what was left of him. He had been the chief engineer, a man who taught me how to bleed a hydraulic line, and now he was a sagging weight of hunger and decay. I didn't hesitate. I swung the wrench with a roar that was more animal than human, the metal burying itself in his temple with a sickening crunch. I didn't stop. I fought them in the rising water, my muscles screaming, my lungs burning with the stench of the grave. It was a ballet of brutality. I used the environment against them, kicking them into the churning machinery, using the narrow gangways to funnel them so they couldn't surround me. I was the grit in the eye of God, and I refused to be blinked away. I fought until my hands were raw, until the wrench was slick with black ichor, and the pile of bodies created a macabre dam against the encroaching tide. When the last of them was down, I collapsed against the generator housing, gasping for air that tasted like salt and copper. The storm was still raging outside, but the rig had stopped tilting. The stabilizers had kicked in. Or maybe the sea had simply grown bored of trying to break me. I spent the next 3 days in a daze, repairing the damage. I welded plates over the breached sections, pumped out the flooded levels, and coaxed the generators back to life. My body was a map of bruises and shallow cuts, but I didn't feel the pain. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I was the master of this iron island. I was the king of a kingdom of rust. But as the storm cleared and the sea calmed into a deceptive, glassy blue, I saw something on the horizon that I hadn't seen in months. A light. It wasn't a star, and it wasn't a hallucination. It was a rhythmic, artificial pulse, a signal. My first instinct was joy, a sharp, piercing needle of hope that almost brought me to my knees. Someone else was out there. Someone was alive. I ran to the radio, my fingers trembling as I dialed through the frequencies, searching for a voice, a hum, anything. But there was only static. The light continued to blink, a steady, indifferent eye in the distance. I watched it for hours, the hope slowly curdling into something else. Who was it? If they had survived, what had they become? The world I knew was gone, replaced by a landscape of monsters and shadows. If there were others, they were either victims or predators. There was no middle ground anymore. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. I didn't recognize the man looking back. My hair was long and matted, my beard a thicket of gray and salt, my eyes sunken and hard as flint. I was the predator now. I was the thing that lived where nothing else could. I spent the night preparing. I didn't know if the light was a rescue or a threat, but I knew I wouldn't be taken easily. I sharpened my blades, checked the fuel levels in the lifeboats, and fortified the entrance to the living quarters. But as the sun began to rise, casting long golden fingers across the water, the light on the horizon vanished. It didn't fade. It just went out, as if whoever was behind it had decided that there was nothing left here worth finding. I stood on the heli deck, the wind whipping my hair, and felt a profound sense of relief. I wasn't ready to go back. I wasn't ready to be a human among humans again. I had been forged in the cold, tempered by the sea, and the thought of a soft world, even a ruined one, felt like a betrayal of the man I had become. I looked down at the water, and for the first time, I saw the beauty in it, the deep, eternal blue, the way it could crush a city or cradle a whale. It was honest. It didn't lie about what it was, and neither did I. I walked back into the heart of the rig, the heavy door clanging shut behind me, sealing me in my fortress. I went to the galley and made a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cold air. I sat in the captain's chair, looking out over my domain. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for the world to try again. I was the world. Every breath I took was a reclamation of the earth. Every day I survived was a victory that didn't need an audience. Months bled into a year. I stopped counting the days and started counting the seasons by the migration of the birds that occasionally rested on the railings. They were the only visitors I allowed. I became a scholar of the rig, learning its language of groans and whistles. I found a stash of books in the lower bunks, old paperbacks with yellowed pages, and I read them by the light of a flickering bulb. My only companions, the ghosts of authors long dead. I thought about the people I had lost, but the pain had become a dull ache, like an old injury that only hurts when the weather changes. I didn't mourn them anymore. I carried them. They were the fuel that kept my fire burning. I realized that the dark I had feared wasn't the absence of light, but the absence of purpose. And I had a purpose. I was the caretaker of the end of the world. I was the one who kept the lights burning on the Titan. 1-4, a beacon for no one, a fire in the middle of a frozen void. It was a lonely life, but it was a pure one. There were no lies here, no politics, no greed. There was only the metal, the sea, and the constant, demanding work of staying alive. One evening, as I was performing my final check of the day, I found a small green sprout growing in a handful of dirt that had collected in a rusted corner of the deck. It was tiny, a fragile, defiant bit of life that shouldn't have been there. It must have come from a seed carried by the wind, or a bird, a hitchhiker from a world that was trying to heal itself. I knelt beside it, my hands, scarred and calloused, trembling as I shielded it from the spray. It was a miracle. It was a catastrophe. It was a reminder that the world wouldn't stay dead forever. Eventually, the green would return. Eventually, the shadows would retreat, and the earth would scream with life again. But not yet. For now, it was just me and the sprout, two stubborn things refusing to quit. I didn't feel the need to be rescued anymore. I didn't need a name or a future. I had the present, and the present was enough. I stood up and looked out at the vast, darkening horizon. The water was turning to ink, and the first stars were beginning to prick through the velvet sky. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in the old world, a quiet, heavy contentment. I had survived the rig. I had survived the dead. I had survived myself. The wind picked up, a sharp, biting gale that smelled of ice and distance. I breathed it in, letting it fill my lungs, letting it remind me that I was still the only thing left that could feel the cold. I wasn't afraid. I was the master of the dark, the sentinel of the salt, the last spark in a world of ash. I turned away from the railing and headed back toward the warmth of the generators. I had work to do. There was a leak in level 3 that needed my attention, and the oil pressure was running a bit high. The rig needed me, and I needed the rig. We were one entity now, a beast of steel and soul, drifting in the great, lonely blue. I smiled, a genuine, quiet expression that didn't feel broken anymore. I was alive, and in a world of the dead, that wasn't a betrayal. It was a promise. The journey hadn't changed shape. It had simply found its destination. I was home. The cold was my blanket. The sea was my song. And the dark was my friend. I walked into the light of the hallway, the heavy thump of my boots echoing like a drumbeat, a steady, defiant rhythm that told the universe I was still here. And as long as I was here, the world wasn't quite finished yet. I reached for the wrench, felt the familiar weight of it in my hand, and stepped into the shadows. I was ready. I was always ready. The cold didn't bother me anymore. It was just the way the world breathed, and I breathed with it, one lungful at a time, one day at a time, until the very end of all things. I was the last spark, and I would burn until there was nothing left to consume. I was the survivor of the Titan 1-4, and this was my kingdom. I closed the door behind me, and for the first time in a long time, the silence was beautiful.